There's a particular kind of reader who spends an hour every night, quietly, with a book open in their lap, or an article scrolling across a phone screen, and inside their own head, their English sounds genuinely beautiful. Every word lands correctly. Complex plots unfold without a single moment of confusion. There's an internal voice reading along silently, with a rhythm that feels, in that private space, entirely natural, almost effortless. And then the book closes, the world outside arrives, and a simple, casual conversation begins. Suddenly, nothing cooperates the way it did on the page. Words stumble. Basic terms come out slightly wrong. There's a strange, maddening delay hunting for a word that was, quite literally, sitting on that same page 5 minutes earlier, clear and familiar in silent reading, somehow gone the instant it needed to become sound. It's a genuinely strange, disorienting experience, and it raises a fair question. Why do reading and speaking feel so completely disconnected, as though they were two entirely separate skills, housed in two entirely separate parts of the brain? Does reading more simply make someone better at reading, while speaking sits frozen exactly where it started? Here's the answer, and it clears up the mystery almost immediately once you see it clearly. Reading and speaking feel disconnected because, for most people, reading has always been treated as an entirely silent, entirely passive activity. And silence, it turns out, is exactly the problem. When you read quietly to yourself, the visual centers of your brain light up, fully engaged, decoding shapes and meaning at remarkable speed. But your vocal cords stay still. Your tongue stays still. The specific motor regions of your brain, responsible for physically producing speech, remain almost entirely dormant throughout the entire process. In other words, silent reading trains your eyes brilliantly. It does almost nothing at all for your mouth. And if your goal is genuinely fluent, confident speech, training only your eyes for years on end will only ever get you halfway there. To turn reading into something that actually strengthens your speaking, you have to break that silence deliberately and make the language physical again. The most fundamental reason learners stumble when speaking English usually isn't a shortage of vocabulary. It's something closer to a lack of vocal muscle memory. English relies on specific mouth shapes, tongue placements, and breathing patterns that are, depending on your native language, often radically different from the ones you grew up using automatically. And if those physical patterns only ever get rehearsed silently inside your own mind, the actual muscles required to produce them out loud remain, quite literally, untrained. Weak, in the same way any muscle stays weak without physical use, no matter how well you understand the theory behind moving it. Reading aloud functions, in a very real sense, as strength training for your mouth. Just 10 minutes a day, spoken rather than silent, forces your brain to link the mental recognition of a word directly to the physical act of producing it, closing a gap that years of silent reading alone simply never touches. But to get the real benefit from this practice, it needs to follow a few specific principles, rather than simply reading a page out loud however feels comfortable. The first principle is speed, or more precisely, the deliberate lack of it. Racing through a paragraph, the way you might read silently for comprehension, actively works against you here. Slow the pace down to roughly half your normal reading speed. Let vowels stretch slightly longer than feels natural at first. Land firmly on every consonant. Give every single word the time it needs to be formed completely and cleanly, rather than blurring past it the way rushed, silent reading habits tend to encourage. The second principle involves breath. Something silent readers rarely think about at all, because silent reading requires almost none of it. Speaking aloud does. Breathe deeply, from lower in your chest than feels instinctive, and project your voice slightly, as though speaking to someone seated a little further away than usual. This builds the actual breath control required to carry a long, complex English sentence all the way to its end, without running out of air halfway through and having to gasp for a hurried breath mid-phrase. Something that happens constantly to speakers, who've never practiced this deliberately. The third principle is attention to friction. The specific moments where your tongue genuinely trips. Keep something to mark with nearby. Whenever a particular combination of sounds catches you off guard, a word like specifically or throughout, words that quietly demand more coordination than they first appear to, stop immediately rather than pushing through the stumble. Mark it. Return to the beginning of that sentence and read it aloud, cleanly, 3 separate times before continuing forward. This isn't about achieving perfection on the first attempt. It's about giving that specific physical movement enough repetition to genuinely settle into muscle memory, rather than remaining a permanent, recurring stumble. Once your mouth is genuinely warmed up through this kind of practice, there's a second, subtler layer worth training, something beyond simply pronouncing individual words correctly. Musicality. The natural rise and fall, the rhythm and stress patterns that make spoken English actually sound like spoken English, rather than a flat, robotic recitation of technically correct words. If you read aloud using the rhythm patterns borrowed from your native language, even with perfect pronunciation of each individual word, the overall effect will still sound subtly, unmistakably foreign to a native ear. Fixing this requires a slightly more advanced technique, something called shadow reading. Shadow reading means reading a text while simultaneously listening to a high-quality audio recording of that exact same text. Using the narrator's voice as a live, real-time guide for your own rhythm and delivery, the process unfolds in 3 stages. First, find a paired audiobook and physical text, or an ebook with matching narration. Listen to a short paragraph while following silently with your eyes, paying close, deliberate attention to exactly where the narrator pauses, which specific words they choose to stress, and how their pitch rises or falls, particularly at the end of a question or a dramatic sentence. Then, play that same passage again, but this time, read out loud simultaneously with the narrator, rather than waiting politely for them to finish before you begin. Try to match their pace exactly, their emotional tone, their pauses, blending your own voice as closely as possible into theirs, almost as though you were trying to disappear into their delivery entirely. Finally, pause the audio altogether and read that same paragraph one more time, completely on your own, attempting to reproduce the precise melody and pacing you just practiced alongside the narrator, without their voice there to guide you any longer. This kind of deliberate, structured imitation works around old, ingrained speech habits in a way that simply explaining rhythm rules never quite manages to. It functions almost like a set of training wheels for your ears and your vocal cords simultaneously, gradually and naturally introducing features like connected speech and proper sentence stress directly into how you speak, even in ordinary, unscripted conversation, long after the specific practice session has ended. None of this works, however, if the material you're practicing with is wrong for your current level, and this is where a great many well-intentioned learners quietly sabotage their own progress. Choose something too difficult, and you'll spend more time stopping to look up unfamiliar words than actually practicing delivery, breaking your vocal flow apart before it ever has a chance to build. Choose something too easy, and there's simply nothing new left to absorb, no fresh phrasing, no unfamiliar rhythm worth training toward. A useful benchmark here is what you might call the 95% rule. Open any potential practice book to a random page and read through it. If more than roughly 5 words on that single page are genuinely unfamiliar, set that book aside for later, once your vocabulary has grown to meet it. What you want, for this particular kind of practice, is a text where the vast majority of words arrive effortlessly, freeing your entire focus for physical delivery rather than comprehension. For learners at an intermediate level, it's worth actively avoiding classic literature and dense academic writing, however tempting either might feel as a marker of serious progress. Characters written a century ago simply don't speak the way people speak today, and dense academic prose was never built for spoken rhythm in the first place. Contemporary fiction aimed at younger readers, or modern memoirs, tend to work far better here, because they're written in the same high-frequency, genuinely conversational vocabulary and natural dialogue patterns you can lift directly from the page and use in an actual conversation later that same day. For more advanced learners, particularly those working towards stronger professional speaking, presentations, or the ability to hold their own in a debate or a high-stakes meeting, popular psychology books, modern business writing, and self-development titles tend to offer something particularly useful. These genres are, by design, built to explain genuinely complex ideas in clear, accessible language. Reading them aloud quietly trains your brain to structure an argument logically, deploy smooth professional transitions, and articulate an opinion clearly, even under the kind of real-time pressure a live conversation always brings. Reading and speaking were never actually two separate islands, cut off from one another by some unbridgeable gap. They're closer to two sides of a single coin, each one incomplete without the other. Reading provides the raw material, vocabulary, grammar, phrasing, all of it absorbed steadily over time. Speaking provides the physical expression of that material, the muscle, the breath, the rhythm that turns silent knowledge into something another person can actually hear and understand. Take your reading off the silent page. Engage your vocal muscles deliberately. Shadow a native narrator's rhythm closely enough to borrow it. And those two skills, so often kept artificially apart, finally begin working as one. So here's a small, immediate place to start. Find whatever you're currently reading, a book, an article, anything nearby. Choose one paragraph, something that feels genuinely manageable rather than intimidating. Stand up if you can. Pull your shoulders back slightly. And read that paragraph out loud, slowly, deliberately, 3 times through, paying close attention the entire time to how your own mouth moves, how your breath supports each sentence, how different it feels from the quiet, internal voice you're used to. That difference, uncomfortable as it might feel at first, is exactly where real speaking fluency actually begins.